Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Susan Fisher Sterling, Director of the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and it's my pleasure to both be with you and welcome you as we open our new fall 2021 season of Women Arts and Social Change programming with this virtual Fresh Talk entitled Plated Politics. As many of you who are with us know, the signature program of our Women Arts and Social Change Initiative is the Fresh Talk. It features cause-driven conversations with artists, designers, activists, writers, social innovatives, and others. These programs are meant to empower women, to spark community involvement, and engage new audiences, including hopefully some of you. In this Fresh Talk, our speakers will explore how women, both within and outside the culinary industry, can forge a new path forward through the culinary arts. This could not be a more timely discussion. And Milani Douglas, the head of our public programs, and our group of speakers here today were saying that this is a time really when leaders in the culinary arts are trying to implement better models for, first of all, living with COVID, and second of all, supporting a large female workforce. Just one note about the pandemic and today's program. We are not in person, in large part still because of the pandemic. We want to take our re-entry into in-person events slowly for the safety of all. But we're also virtual because the museum has just this month closed its building at 1250 New York Avenue for a major 2-year renovation. Although we're virtual now, as well as we settle into living with COVID, we look forward to hosting hybrid gatherings later in this season, most likely in the spring. And then, of course, we can't wait to come together in person once again in our newly renovated facilities in fall 2023. Milani Douglas, our Director of Public Programs, often reaches out to you during these introductions to say that membership is an excellent way to support the museum. I'm going to trump that a bit. I'd like to offer that you can support NMWA and its programs now by giving to the Capital Campaign. There is loads of information on our website for anyone who's interested in helping us to recreate the museum, to create it anew for the next generation. And you can always talk to me. I'm happy to engage in this conversation. So on to today's program. On behalf of the museum, it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers, Jessica B. Harris, Soleil Ho, Therese Nelson, and Laura Shapiro. And then, of course, thank you to our amazing sponsors who make this initiative possible over the last 5+ years. We have leadership gifts from Denise Littlefield Sobel, the Davis Dore Family Fund, the Ravada Foundation of the Logan family, and the Susan and Jim Swartz Public Programs Fund. Additional funding has been provided by the Bernstein Family Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. And now it's my honor, as well as my pleasure, to turn the program over to Milani Douglas.
Hello, welcome to our first Fresh Talk of the season. We have been excited about this program and hoping that it could come together for over 2 years now, so it is a pleasure to be here. I want to open the conversation with a quote from Toni Morrison. She once said, "I stood at the border, I stood at the edge and claimed it as central and let the rest of the world move over to where I was." Her statement puts language to the necessary work that women find themselves doing if they want equity in their fields, or if they just simply refuse to let themselves or the world slide into a hellish boredom of an existence narrated by the same voices, telling the same stories at the same table with the same food again and again. What unites the work of our guests today is not only their ability to brilliantly center the experiences of their individual and collective communities in the food world. They are also masters of analysis, critique, and research, creating work that pushes food narratives into a delicious state of correction. Their work is here changing how we talk about food in the past, the present, and in the future. Today, I welcome culinary historian, professor and author Jessica B. Harris, food critic, chef, podcast host, and author Soleil Ho, chef, author, and founder of Black Culinary History, Therese Nelson, and culinary historian Laura Shapiro to have this conversation about the plated politics of the food industry. I want to take a moment for Laura Shapiro for joining us again. I also want to thank playwright and director Gabrielle Fulton for introducing me to Jessica B. Harris, and Michael Twitty for introducing me to Therese Nelson. It is relationships and communities gathered around tables and shared meals that has made much of this conversation possible. I also want to thank our generous donors for their continued support, especially this past year. During a time of duress, we were able to continue to support artists and create innovative programming and pivot to bring new programming that pushes art's role in social change. Without any further delay, I turn this conversation over to our speakers so that they may tell you more about their work. Enjoy the presentations and the conversations.
Last spring, I published a review of a cookbook that was making an unusual argument for a cookbook. The author said that while written recipes are useful, they aren't in fact necessary. He said if you need recipes, if you depend on exact instructions and measurements, just liberate yourself. Get a sense of the recipe and then let yourself go. Don't worry about precise measurements or even precise ingredients. Said substitutions would work fine. So the recipes in this book were written to be suggestions, not blueprints. And he promised that once you got used to this way of thinking about cooking, you'd be having fun in the kitchen, improvising your way to dinner like a great jazz musician. Well, I read this and I had my doubts. I know a lot of wonderful home cooks who approach the kitchen just this way. They take a look at a recipe, then their imaginations take over. They have great instincts, great palates. Whatever they make turns out beautifully. I'm not like that. I've been cooking for decades, and I know by now that I don't have the instincts and I don't have the palate to wing it. I like things to come out the way they're supposed to. The last thing I'm tempted to do is drop the recipe and go off on some tangent of my own. In fact, I'm a little extreme on this subject. If a recipe calls for a teaspoon of oregano and there's half a teaspoon only left in the jar, I get scared and I switch to another recipe. What I like about cooking is that I get to feed my friends and family from my own hands. I get to do something for the people I care about. That is the reward. And since I only make things that I'm absolutely sure will work, the food is usually okay. The other reason I cook is maybe even more important. I believe in it. I believe we have an obligation to cook at home, and we have a social and political obligation to make that possible for everyone. Packaged ready-made foods, takeout, and restaurants, yes, they have a place in our lives. I love going to restaurants, but I don't want to rely on those things. I want them to be exceptions. I think it is a terrible idea to depend on the food industry to make all the decisions about what we eat. The food industry has a bad track record when it comes to making those decisions. So I cook and I follow recipes fanatically because I have no other way of cooking. After the article was published, I started hearing from women who felt the same way. Like me, they depend on recipes. They said they were sick of feeling guilty about it, or as if they were doing something wrong or shameful or second rate. They had been told or picked up the notion that if you're a real cook, you don't need recipes. Real cooks can make a beautiful meal out of whatever looks good in the market or whatever happens to be sitting around in the refrigerator. Real cooks, in other words, are creative. The rest of us somehow don't count. All we do is put food on the table. This emphasis on creativity as supremely important, the one and only definition of real cooking or good cooking, was not always with us. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was something called a good plain cook. You could describe someone as a good plain cook, and it would be a compliment. It meant she knew how to cook a cheap cut of meat so it came out juicy and flavorful. It meant she could boil a potato that came out light and tender, not soggy. It meant her rice pudding was comforting. Her coffee was fragrant and strong. Most important, of course, her bread was perfect. Sounds good to me. So what happened? Why did that compliment go away? When did basic good food stop being good enough? When did creativity become non-negotiable? There are a number of ways to answer this question. My favorite, I have to admit, takes us back to the decades right after World War II and a phenomenon I think of as man in the kitchen. In fact, a cookbook came out in 1946 called That Man in the Kitchen by a journalist named Malcolm LaPrade, who wrote a syndicated newspaper column by that name. This book was a collection of his recipes, and he explained that it had been practically impossible for him to write them down because he himself was such a free and easy cook. He never even bothered to measure anything. He said he did include measurements in the book. They were only approximations, and he certainly hoped that no man using this book would feel he had to pay attention to them. So this theme, the free and easy male cook who disdains recipes, shows up again and again in the 1950s and 60s. A writer named Joseph Wexberg, much celebrated for his expertise in gastronomy, wrote in 1959, "I'm sorry for my friends whose wives cook by the book, slavishly following formulas and recipes. The truth is that only men have the techniques, the discipline, and the passion that make cooking consistently an art. Hence, the great masters and professionals are men." Then there's Leonard Jan Mitchell, who was a New York restaurant owner in those years. He wrote, "What we men object to is the pedestrian, unimaginative approach that most women have to cooking. Not realizing that a cookbook is meant to be a point of departure, she honors and obeys its every ingredient, but man experiments, embellishes, and is no slave to the cookbook." You get the idea. Men are the artists, women are the drudges. It's a gender hierarchy that always defined professional cooking. After the war, it spread into home cooking. Why? Well, one thing about gender hierarchies, they follow the money. And after World War II, people started spending money in their kitchens and on their cooking. They bought refrigerators and stoves, they bought mix masters and wearing blenders, and they started experimenting with the fancy new recipes that ran in the glossy magazines, coq au vin, crêpes Suzettes, cheese soufflés. This was a narrow segment of America, mostly white, many of them new to the middle class, but it was a growing segment of the population. And the advertising industry was very interested in them, which meant newspapers and magazines were very interested. So you started seeing a lot of male imagery in the food stories. Dad in a chef's hat, rubbing garlic in a big wooden salad bowl, talking about imported cheese, carrying on about wine. Of course, it was a total fantasy. Most men never stepped into a kitchen except maybe to make pancakes on a Sunday morning. But you needed that version of Dad if you were going to promote the idea of fancy new equipment and glamorous new recipes. The traditional image of home cooking, Mom in her apron with an apple pie, was all about love. No profit margin there. The new imagery, man in the kitchen, the artist passionately at work on his vinaigrette, was all about dollar signs. So that was it. Farewell to the good plain cook. Making ordinary familiar dishes lost its status as an honorable daily activity. You had to do something creative or you weren't really cooking. But I am here to say, if you feel the way I do about this, go ahead and serve that same casserole you have been making for years. Put it on the table and be proud. It does not need pomegranate seeds. If you made it yourself, you are a great cook. Thank you.
Yeah, I love all of that. I was so excited to be part of this conversation, mainly to hear from women like Laura Shapiro and Dr. Harris and Soleil. So I'm just, as a viewer, excited to be part of hearing from these women. When I thought about what I wanted to share with y'all today, I really thought about positionality. Very often when we think about women in food and women's relationships with food, we think about it relative to the home. And I didn't grow up with these really robust, deep-rooted culinary memories of, my mother as this sort of central figure in our relationship with food. And so when I decided to become a professional chef, it was this way of finding place for myself and finding culinary language for myself in ways that I didn't grow up with. The problem with that is that when you enter this industry, the conventional wisdom or conventional knowledge is that you aren't a unique or you are an authentic chef unless you're white and male. And it seems so strange that I was being sort of shown how to be a credible professional chef by white men when intuitively I knew for sure that women and Black women in particular had always been the practitioners of this industry. I think my work now situates itself with knowing the truth for myself as a professional, as a tactic and a tool to be a better steward of our culture in food. I started my website, Black Culinary History, in 2008 because I was a reckless cook. I was operating in my work in a way that was ahistoric because I didn't know better. I hadn't discovered Jessica Harris's books. I didn't know that as a Black woman in this country, I was a uniquely American chef. That if I had just had, a sort of spark, if I'd had a starting point to sort of begin to engage with these writers, that I would have engaged my whole career differently. And so the site really was personal catharsis for the first 5 or 6 years. It was me discovering and engaging with Dr. Harris. If you have not read her book, Hot Stuff, please get it right now. Like, I don't know, on your phone, order it immediately. But to engage with books like that, to engage with Vermeer Groves, and to hear and be affirmed by the idea that I am uniquely an American chef was game-changing. The way I think about my relationship with my work is really about starting point. It's really about inspiration point. We do that, especially from a professional point of view. We give ourselves over to this industry in ways that take a lot from us. It takes our energy, it takes our spirit, it takes a lot to suit up daily. When I put my whites on, I think every day about my grandma as a domestic worker when she migrated north from South Carolina. I think about what it means to have a professional relationship with food that is very different than my personal one. And I think that those relationships, that's sort of the alchemy of finding yourself in work you do professionally, that is so tied to something that is so elemental and so personal, is a tricky balance to try and strike. But I center the quote Melanie gave at the beginning of this presentation was so beautiful, because I think that I 100% move center of my culinary life, my culinary mind, into Blackness and womanhood. And it allows me to sort of stand really firmly where I am, and hopefully folks kind of engage with what I find interesting and what I find beautiful about my work and the work of so many of my peers, and it becomes a starting point. I don't really want to take up too much more time because I want to hear from everybody else, but I'll just say that, especially from a professional standpoint, this moment is so interesting to sort of ask ourselves bigger, more important questions about why we do this work. This industry is getting much more diverse is a trite word, but it's getting a lot more easy to stand where you are and have the room and the expansiveness to tell the stories you want to tell. There are so fewer restrictions on access to opportunity to storytell. And if you are given the opportunity to have a voice and to do the work you want to do in your most central self, that's a responsibility that you should take so seriously. And I think that most of what I'm interested in is arming other Black chefs with as much good information to be more equipped to do that work responsibly. So there's that.
Wow. Therese, I don't know if it's because I had too much coffee this morning in anticipation of this talk, but emotionally, I feel so affected by what you just said. Thank you for that. So appropriately, hello, I'm Soleil Ho. I am a food critic. I work for the San Francisco Chronicle, which based in San Francisco. And I wanted to talk about why I'm a food critic, because I don't think, for the longest time, I didn't think that this would be a job that I could have. And I want to sort of tease that out a little bit. So why food criticism? It to me, politically, right, it feels like one of the most indulgent, unnecessary jobs that could exist in the world. When people are going hungry, when there are so many, places are on fire, there's earthquakes, hurricanes, why does food criticism matter? And I'm not here to say that it matters as much as all those other things, because I'm very hyper aware of my role in society and in life. But it feels like food is so denigrated, right? Because historically, right, it has been women's work, whatever we want to, call that. It is so vernacular. It is so banal. It is something that we all engage with every day. And many people do not want to think very hard when they're eating. Food is a source of pleasure. And these days, you don't want to associate pleasure with thought, even though that's kind of a social construction. I'm a food critic because I want to disrupt all of that. Not in the Silicon Valley way of talking about disruption, not that. I'm not going to space anytime soon, but more like food to me is a Trojan horse. It is a way to get people to think and talk about deeper systemic issues, to talk about ideology, labor, art, discourse, history. And, all the speakers on this panel can testify to that, how food has been such an amazing way to get at so many deeper issues. But food criticism in particular hasn't really been that place, right? It hasn't been as permeable as, for instance, books about food history, food studies within academia, or even just, freelance work, just like work out there for magazines and newspapers about food. For some reason, it remains a staid genre, a staid profession. And, most of the time, what you get is, I went to this place, I had a steak, it was kind of salty, didn't love that, here's the wine list, right? That is like the reputation of service journalism. And oftentimes, right, like food criticism and food writing and newspapers in particular was sort of the greener pastures to which people who were on harder beats like crime, real estate, business would retire, with the assumption that anyone could do it. And let's give this person a really gentle sending off and let them do the food writing or food criticism, because anyone can do it. And for me, that made it even more exciting to get into as an intellectual, as someone who is so passionate about rewriting the political discourse, sort of passions that were not necessarily amenable with the genre of food criticism. Doubling on top of that is the reputation of food writing as women's news, right? Usually you see it next to the comics or the crossword. It's not right next to business or the other, like I said, harder news. And so my perspective is that people would approach it unguarded. People would go towards food writing and food criticism with not expecting something unpleasant or politically fraught. They would go to it and be open to it, much like humor. It breaks down those walls and makes people more willing to hear what you have to say, which is why it's so important to me. As a result, I think I get a lot of, responses from established readers, subscribers about how I should stick to food. And that has been something that has dogged me for my entire career of writing about food for the past, decade, is just write about food, which is really funny because that's never been something that I've done. So that would be a new thing for me. So at the same time, you're right, that's why I write pieces about, for instance, recently I wrote a review about Impossible Foods chicken nuggets, which are plant-based. And I wrote about labor, and I wrote about, the potential and the drawbacks of having tech take over our diets and over the food industry. I wrote about a Vietnamese fusion restaurant in San Francisco and how its decor, which was, as they admitted, evocative of colonial Vietnam and 1950s French Indochina, how they made that happen, how that manifested in the decor and the photography that they used, and why, being asked to position yourself in the identity of a French colonizer when you're going out to eat is not necessarily pleasurable to everyone out there. And those are the pieces that I think are nearest and dearest to my heart. They're reviews, but they're open to so many other sorts of considerations when you talk about criticism, cultural criticism, for instance. It's not just about the food, and it never will be. But I do think that it does perform a service for readers. That to me is the most exciting part about this job. And I think that's why, not to toot my own horn too much, but I think that's why what I'm doing matters. That's why that's what I'm hoping for food criticism as a whole, for it to become a platform for talking, using, how should I say this? Turning restaurants and turning dishes, turning food into texts. And within literary cultural criticism, the text is the product, right? The film, the book, literal text that an analyst really digs into, really picks apart, really pulls out. Okay, they use this word because of being in this era, because of this ideology, this discourse that was happening at the time. I want people to be able to read restaurants and have restaurants become legible to them in a way that will enable them to see, okay, we're here in history. It doesn't have to be like that, but these are all choices that have been made because of the moment that we're in. And in so doing, they'll be able to apply that mindset to everything around them, everything, society, politics, economics, just all the things, especially food, right, that we are told not to think too hard about because there are so many other things that are more important. But I would argue that food is among the most important things that we could think about. So why does it matter that someone like me is doing this? I try not to think too hard about identity politics as in the conventional sense, right? As far as representation goes. Yes, I am a non-binary woman. Yes, I am a Southeast Asian. But I think what we have seen is in many instances of representational politics is that the identity matters so much less than the action and the belief system that is espoused by this person. and I'm thinking especially about the time after the sort of onset of the Trump administration in America, where many food publications sent out sort of missives about how immigrants matter, about how immigrants make America taste better, and how they're going to care a lot about diversity and identity and about more, broader, diverse stories. And what resulted was just a lot of shallow representation, just having people who were, for instance, Indian, just do Indian stories about the whole subcontinent, having, again, like running the Black History Month stories and not really running stories about Black Americans the rest of the year. There are certain things about it that felt really shallow. And I want us all, one of the takeaways is to just like think about that. Next time a food publication is saying that they're doing something good, and think about why diversity in food matters and just what the point is. And so, I try to think really hard all the time about like, what is the purpose of my existence in doing this job and doing this work, in coming to work every day and trying to figure out more ways to say that something is delicious. It matters a lot. And I think remembering that and making sure people understand that is just the purpose of my life right now. And yeah, I don't want to keep going because I know that was a lot and pretty dense, but yeah, that's me.
Getting 15 million things that are telling me to unmute myself while I'm unmuting myself. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Milani. Wow, I'm not sure I'm happy with being at the end of this sort of stellar group of folks, but here goes. I am, interestingly, a little bit of a bookend to Laura Shapiro's initial thing, because it was lovely listening to her opening statement, but I recall very much writing in the kind of last words of High on the Hog. Well, it's talk about African-American food, and I don't have the time to read it all, but I do say it's the warmth of the kitchen tempered by the formality of the dining room and the love of family that extends over generations and across bloodlines. With the improvisational genius that gave the world jazz and salsa, as well as rumba, rap, and reggae, we have cooked our way into the hearts, minds, and stomachs of a country. So I was the one of those who was voting for improvisation there. And I guess that's because I am myself one of those improvisational cooks that the gentleman was writing about, that Laura Shapiro referred to. But I think also I come to cooking in a funny way through my entire life. I come to food through how I came up and perhaps who I am. When we were asked initially if we wanted to do a PowerPoint or a presentation, I'm not good at PowerPoints and such as that, thought of one image that would have begun to talk about me and food. And that image is one that I think may have been in print at one point in the welcome table, and it is me age, I think 3 or 4, no older than that, on the floor of the kitchen in my parents' house, which is the place where I grew up until I was 6. So I know I was definitely under 6 in the image. And I'm fiddling around in the kitchen. And I'm fiddling around in the kitchen with a pie pan or something like that. I am there. But that's where it started for me. It started with my mother. My mother was actually a trained dietitian. Okay, so when we start to talk about some of those things, one of the things that Laura, if I may, didn't go into was the whole notion of how home economy, home economics became a very important thing in the world, and particularly in women's worlds of food. It was a science. It was not an art. But my mother was one of those individuals who made the science an art. She was an extraordinarily improvisational cook. And when I say that, she was one of those left brain, right brain cooks who could not only improvise with cooking, as it were, but could also improvise with baking. And that is the astonishing, start of it all, if you will. She was able to, we didn't have bread. I got some flour, and she'd throw together biscuits, and they were really biscuits. That came from knowledge, but it also came from heritage, I think, in a way, because I think that African American cooks, and to some degree chefs, as one moves, if one does, from cooking to chefing. And I think we need to make some distinctions there. And I'm always trying to be very careful about talking about chefs as being heads of kitchens, chef de cuisine in French. You are at the head of the kitchen. Everybody else in the kitchen cook. You are a chef de partie, a chef de cuisine. Chef simply means head, comes from, the same Latin root as caput, your head, like your capital punishment. You take somebody's head off. So if you're the chef, you're the head of the kitchen. African Americans, even though they may have been the chefs, were never allowed to be the chefs. But I don't want to digress down that rabbit hole because that'll keep me for a while. But I want to go back to that. So I start with my mother, who is a home economist. And she worked at it. She was a dietitian at a hospital and didn't particularly enjoy it. She was a dietitian at Bennett College in North Carolina. She said the only thing she got out of that experience was the ability to cook grits and love them. And she was a private dietitian for the Huntington Hartford family. She didn't have to cook the meals, she just had to organize them. And she was dissuaded from that job by her friends. This would have been in the mid to late 1930s, because her friends said that was too much like being in service and that should not be what she was doing. So she stopped doing food. She became a secretary, but I grew up with great meals and extraordinary home cooking. The fact that my mother worked allowed my aspirational, oh, so aspirational family to send me to the UN school, the United Nations International School, where I was, I've been told, the first non-UN child to go. Now, what that means is I am in the 1950s now, eating Indian food, eating Polish food, eating Chinese food from regions of China, long before these things are appearing on the American plate, if you will, or in the American home. And so that started my kind of diverse palate and questing ability, if you will. I went from the UN school to the High School of Performing Arts. I majored in theater. That explains an awful lot about me to anybody who knows me fairly well. But it certainly explains my love of story and storytelling. And I think that's a part of what I do with food. I then ping-ponged around. I have an extremely diverse academic background. I went to Bryn Mawr College, and there, research. a gentleman who was actually a professor at Harvard in the, I suspect, 60s, named Tom Lehrer, wrote a song in which he said, well, he was being arch about it, plagiarize, let no one else's work evade your eyes. Remember why the good Lord made your eyes. But the idea is to research, read everything out there, not just the things people tell you should read, but the things they don't want you to read, or the things that they think are beneath you to read. Read it all. From that, I went to graduate school. I began to travel. I made my first trips into what we now call, or what I now call, certainly the African Atlantic world. And I learned and in some way became a participant observer. I made friends. And then I would go to their houses, and in their houses, I would watch them cook. I would watch their mothers cook. I would watch their maids cook. I would watch their cooks cook. I'd be the one that was out there on the little, tripod stool next to the big feu malgache, which is basically an outdoor grill, wondering what's in the pot, how are you doing this, what are you doing with this, and so on and so forth. So all of that then begins to come together in the mid to late 70s as I become a journalist. And I'm writing now travel for Essence Magazine, and then go beyond that and begin to write about travel and food. Fools rush in. I wrote a column called, bad title for a column, but it was called The Go Gourmet. This was in the late 1970s. So I have taken to telling people I was doing Anthony Bourdain before Anthony Bourdain was doing Anthony Bourdain. I was talking about food and culture and travel in an international sense, because I didn't just cover the African Atlantic world. I went to Hong Kong and dined around with Willie Mark. I went, to a variety of places, no need to review. And I did that. And then in the, I guess, 1985, I start to write my first cookbook, and all of that kicks in. And that's the book that Therese gracefully and graciously sort of trumpeted a few minutes ago. It was called Hot Stuff, and it was a cookbook in praise of the Piquant. And what it did was it took me not to the usual recipe, but to the history. And I never thought of myself as a food historian until a lady named Nancy Harmon Jenkins said, Jessica Harris is a food historian, and as it was said, then you kind of had to step up, go to the bar and figure out what you do and how you do it and how to do it better. So I owe that to Nancy Harmon Jenkins. I've also been a restaurant reviewer, Soleil. I did 6 years of restaurant writing, criticism, if you will, reviewing perhaps, for the Village Voice in New York City. I'm not a professional chef, but I am a home cook, except I have always been of the sort of fools rush in variety. I remember once I was making coq au vin. I was following, assiduously following one of those 3 or 4 page Julia Child recipes, and then realized, oops, I had no pearl onions. I obviously hadn't done my mise en place, but I did have a can of black-eyed peas. I said, black-eyed peas, pearl onions, black-eyed peas, pearl onions. Well, what the hell? I threw the black-eyed peas in. It wasn't coq au vin, but it was delicious. I was happy. My guests were happy. We went on. So all of that kind of comes together and talks about meat and food. But I guess to sum it up, I would quote from, I wish I had a lovely quote from Toni Morrison, as you did, Laura. That was glorious. But Zora Neale Hurston said she wrote about history through the spyglass of anthropology. I guess if I had to sum it up, I would say I use food as a spyglass for looking at history. And that's me.
We're going to now have all of our guests join us for a delightful conversation. I typically don't come in at this moment, but I have to say this. You all's presentations were just fantastic, so connected, and deeply rooted in each other's work. So may the conversation continue. Thank you so much.
Wow. So we just to sort of talk among yourselves?
Cool. Well, I just want to start by fangirling a little bit because Laura Shapiro's book, Perfection Salad, was I read it in college, and it was one of the first glimpses sort of waking up from the Matrix. I'm just thinking like, oh, food history. There's like, that's something that's like worth writing a lot about. So thank you.
Absolutely. It's one of the uber texts, if you will, of it all. And Laura and I guess, share that whole thing of being there before there was a there. I mean, this is clearly a generationally divided set of folks. As I'm sure you know, Laura, well, you know, we have a few barnacles on our bows and have been, you know, out there before this was a discipline.
Yes. No, absolutely. And the fact is, Perfection Salad, which came out in the mid 1980s and is still in print, I'm proud to say, I had an incredibly difficult time finding a publisher for that book because, as you say, Jessica, there wasn't a field, and it didn't have a place. You could certainly write cookbooks. It was getting to be more possible to write about women, but there was no there was no way to look at women's work in the kitchen as something that was worth thinking about. So when I wrote that and I put women at the heart of it, I thought, you know, this is revolutionary. I'm doing this big thing. It was big then, but what's happening now is the real huge thing, which is, you know, to hear from all of you who are really doing it. It's not just women, you know, it's unbelievable worldwide scope of women in this country alone, in every kind of community, and then looking around the world. And that's where this study of cuisine has moved and gone. That's obviously, Jessica, you've charged out ahead there and made that happen. And then these young people here on the panel are holding up the world themselves. So it is kind of an amazing thing to see what's happened.
Sitting there, I wonder if you and Dr. Harris could talk a little bit about praxis, because I think there's something really powerful. Like, I'm impacted by what Dr. Harris said about, like, essentially just starting from a place of consuming everything, reading everything, being so rigorous in your own individual practice in a way that informs you and makes you better. That's the whole of where I situate myself, mainly because there is no educational pathway to do the work you all do, right? To your point about creating space, creating an industry, essentially. I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about where you see or what you include into the, like, culinary history praxis. Like, what should we be sort of using as tools as we sort of try and do this work rigorously?
Well, you first, so you go, Laura. I'll go after.
You know, I think when I start to work on something, I try to pick up where everybody else has sort of answered the question. You can question those answers, and you can keep going from there. I wrote a book about the 50s, and the thing to be said about the 50s when I started was, oh, American women love to cook out of packages and they didn't want to be in the kitchen. And they were so thrilled to see these new products coming along. So when I started that research on this book, I thought, well, that must be the story. That's what I'm going to be writing about, how American women rushed to do the Jell-O salads and whatnot. And as I did the work, turned the pages of the magazines and read the history and read the memoirs and read what people were saying, I realized that history wasn't what really had happened. That was the history as written by the food industry. Women did not rush to these things. They didn't want these things. They had no interest in these things. It was a battlefield where you had the real home cooks and you had the food industry shoving this stuff at them. And a lot happened on that battlefield, and that became the book. So I would say, don't take anything at face value. Use your instincts, those same instincts that are making you wonderful cooks, and they'll make you wonderful readers. Soleil, it's what you've been talking about is kind of exactly that. You're not doing it the same old way. You're asking completely different questions. You're taking this well-known form, the restaurant review, and I don't know, not throwing it out, but turning it around and putting in what a lot of other people have left out.
Upending it, dare I say.
Yeah.
I mean, to answer your question, Therese, I think in the case of African Americans, the first thing we have to do, and I think it's the case for not just African Americans, but I am, and so that's where I always start from. It's about find yourself. How do you find yourself? Because text is not there necessarily. So that in some places and in some cases, the finding yourself is about doing something that I have come to call studying the silences. It's like you learn to almost read a text inside out or backwards to see what might be the case of folks who aren't talked about, who aren't necessarily discussed in the room or even placed in the room by text, but who were in the room. And they were in the room. So the idea is, how do you find them? How do you read in between the lines? How do you look for those little snippets or parenthetical remarks almost that then become the building blocks for the history that you're trying to tell? And then that's a whole nother way. So it's almost, as the French, the man named Huysmans wrote a book called À rebours, backwards, literally. It's about doing it almost backwards, because you're looking at it from, it's like looking at, looking through a spyglass this way or that way. I'm not talking about closer or further away. I'm talking about looking for oneself in the text. And I think that happens on any number of cases. I mean, I think that can happen with gender. I think that certainly happens with race. It happens in so many ways when you look for the little thing that makes your eyebrow go up and you go, oh, there I am. That's me. That's what they aren't saying, or that's what they're talking around as you read something. And then that's what I build from. Or then that's when I start to dig.
Amen.
I actually, if you don't mind, I had a follow-up question to that question, which is, I would love to ask our sort of intellectual trailblazers on the panel.
Great people.
Well, just you have a much more, I think, in-depth view of just the rhetoric around cooking and around food, just over the past few decades. And I would love to know if there is anything that remains to be said. There always is, but just like, what do you see as the major gaps in our understanding that persist?
Oh,
It's
wow.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. It's and it really, in a way, it follows very nicely on what you were just saying, Jessica. You talk about finding yourself. That's the key for you, for a Black American researcher, or for a Southeast Asian researcher. If you're a white middle class American researcher, you're already there. The key there is to get beyond yourself, not assume that everything I see is about me. To remember and think about and look for everything that has been left out. So I think there's tons out there that we haven't found, because so much of the work has been done by people with a narrow perspective, my own and many other people. So you can go back to a lot of written history and write it again, as well as forging new stuff. But there's, the last word has not been written on a lot of stuff. The first word put middle-class white Americans in the center of the story. Well, there's a lot of other stories, and that same story has a lot of other perspectives that could be written. So I'd say there's just, there's way more.
But even who were considered middle-class white Americans, at what point? Are we talking about German Americans who have been in many ways left out of the food spectrum? Are we talking about Jewish Americans who have not necessarily been acknowledged? Are we, who are these, uber middle-class white Americans? The only thing that probably is, conjoining them is skin color. And was that who they were when they arrived? Certainly it wasn't the case with the Italians or the Irish. And then how do you find yourself in that? So then we've got a whole nother level. And I think that's to me, one of the sort of blind spots, is people like to think it's white versus, BIPOC. It's not. Half the white people in this country weren't white until they got here, and weren't white when they first got here.
Yeah.
They just gradually sort of seeped in and became white, and now assumes that, oh, well, our history is part of that uber overarching history. It is not.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that needs to be looked at and studied, because I think that will begin to tell us, among other things, why we're in this mess, but how we could all begin then to decide to say, okay, we're here, we're going to be white. We may not have been white where we came from, but we're here, we're going to be white now. Now that's one thing, but the only way that a lot of folks are white is in contrast to folks who aren't, who then never get to be white, no matter how long they've been here. Okay, so we got a whole lot of unpiling and looking at that before we can even look at who these middle-class white folks were, because they weren't who they say they were. And that's, again, another part of that studying the silence. That's another part of looking at that. That's another part of going deeper. That's another part of really approaching this thing with a degree of honesty about this country and its politics that we have not had and are not really at yet. So that we need to begin to think about asking some of those hard questions. Asking some of those hard questions, who were those folks who were defining this white middle classness, and why was everybody in such a rush and a hurry to get there? And how did they get there? And who did they, not necessarily who did they jump over in terms of race, but how did they get in there? And some of the ways that they got in there was by eating that diet, by following those cookbooks, by meticulously preparing those meals that were absolutely accurate because they were proclamations of their middle classness and their whiteness. So that all of that then becomes a part of the conversation that needs to be held, which is probably a larger conversation.
All the snaps, all like, oh my goodness.
No, it's great. And you know, saying that, Therese, it reminds me of what you were saying about your particular journey, kind of in terms of your heritage, and that it was not a clear path to, that you had a lot of kind of nooks and crannies to figure out, to find where you were going to be in, you know, there you were, a Black cook, but you weren't going to be an old image of a Black, you were going to be yourself. But where was that going to be situated?
I think it ties so directly to what Dr. Harris was saying to me when it's the, you know, beginning of the 2000s and entering into culinary school and finding myself looking at this very white male dominated space that just intuitively seems ridiculous. And to have an aspiration to emulate these men in this way that it instantly tells me I have no room to show up fully in this work I'm about to give my whole life over to is absurd. But then you start to read stories about how women, Black women particularly, have found whole lives for themselves as caterers, have, you know, sort of used food and the food space as this empowering opportunity. Changed my entire relationship with what I was going to do with the rest of my career. That said, though, that idea about whiteness as this, it's like attainable. So much of what I'm interested in is to create a praxis for research so that white folks can dismantle their own whiteness. I'm interested in what your cultural makeup is. If you come to this idea of who you are in food and ask that question seriously, it dismantles all ideas of whiteness. It requires you to be a whole person with all kinds of ethnic makeup and family heritage that comes from lots of places. And if we're honest, if you're more honest about that, the food instantly gets more delicious. It gets more critical. It gets more, I don't know. I just think that there's this way that we sort of dismiss that we all have legitimate, like, individual stories to tell. And it's not this weird homogenous, virtue signal. I don't know, there's this signal about American virtue, that kind of overarching Americanness is a tricky balance to sort of try and live up to when it is constructed. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to that point too, I think that's one of the functions of food criticism that is so poignant about it, is that our job is to normalize, you know, our job is to set the standard and get, you know, our historically white middle class audience to see, like, who is a chef actually. If we just assume, you know, a chef, like anybody can be a chef, like that comes through in the writing, right? If you write about, if you write with the attitude that food from communities of color is exceptional or like a spectacle or different, then like people are going to pick up on that. Your readers are going to pick up on that. And, you know, finding new audiences, right? Like you not using that kind of constructed idea of that like ghostly white middle class person, not having that ghost haunt you as you write every word is so powerful and so important, because people will immediately pick up on that and recognize that. So, I mean, I think that to me is part and parcel with the work that everyone else does.
This is why you killing the game, actually. Like I'm just so you talking about fangirl and everybody. I want to take this time because your writing has been so important to me in my positionality. Like I think my world is so Black and so like it is relatively homogenous, right? Like I'm in community with other Black creators, and there's this way that I find that we because I have to show up and consider my positionality in every choice I make, every way in which I engage this industry. I take for granted that that positionality is not necessarily the case with everybody else. And something that's so important about what you're doing is sort of asking us all, regardless of what marginalized spaces you exist in, but we all have biases, we all have places we start from. And it's asking us all to be much more critical about how we engage in this industry in a way that is going to make us all more just thoughtful. And I just so appreciate knowing that your work is in the world. Every time I come in contact with it, it makes me smarter and better. And I don't know, just more, it forces me to look outside my very Black bubble. So I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad more thoughtful and not more anxious because, it's a very thin line between those things.
Soleil, you used a really interesting expression when you spoke. You talked about, the kind of Americans waking up to the idea of diversity, and suddenly we saw what you called shallow representation all across the spectrum. And as you said, the cook of South Asian background is expected to do only this, and the cook of Jamaican background is expected to do only that, and the limits there. How do we get beyond that? What's the bigger world that's out there for those writers and those cooks and us readers?
Yeah, I mean, like the typical answer, I think, which is sounds simple, but it's very complicated, is that so much of this has to do, this being like the shallow representation, has to do with who's gatekeeping, right? Who are the publishers, for instance, picking up on the manuscripts? Who are the editors of food publications? Do they just want to fill a quota or just check off a box for, okay, we need to make the South Asians happy. Let's do this, right? We need to make the Black people happy. Let's do this. Sorry, I was taking on the voice of a bad editor. I think replacing those people is really important. Not to say that they should be put on an island somewhere, but more just like they should step aside when it is time to step aside and really like think about who they are being replaced with. I mean, I recall when I got my job, a lot of the hullabaloo was over my identity, right? And not actually my politics and what I was going to do. And there was an assumption that the politics came with the identity. And I think decoupling those things will be really important going forward.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I know it does. So what does that mean for you? This is about you because in your role as a critic, you go into a Japanese restaurant and it's the head chef, the chef de cuisine, is a Black woman, who's studied that cooking and is doing wonderful food. Is there anything wrong with that? Is it worthy? Is that our goal? Is that what we are striving for? I love the idea, but tell me I'm wrong if I am.
Yeah, no, I recently wrote a little bit about this Japanese restaurant in San Francisco where the owner and I think most of the staff were Mexican. Uh-huh. And they make some of the most incredible sushi in the city. Yeah. And to me, that is so exciting, not in the fact of their identity and how it may be perceived to clash with their work, but more just a representation of who's working in kitchens and who gets to take credit. Because I think especially in regards to Mexican Americans, they do a lot of the heavy work in the restaurant industry here. So to see someone actually get their flowers, to actually have ownership and a stake in cuisine that they've studied so hard for. I think that to me is like super exciting. And I think traditionally there have been so many people who have not given credit where credit is due for their labor, as everyone on the panel spoke to. So to see that in action, I think is incredible. And of course, like, not all things are made the same. And I think there is a history of white chefs and white like investors and restaurant owners taking on cuisines from myriad influences and making money off of that. And like, that's a whole other conversation. And it is part of another pattern of like imperialism, colonization, just like cultural theft that has informed much of world history. So
Right.
yeah, there are many nuances to it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and that whole question of appropriation, if you will, because that's what we're really talking about obliquely,
Yes.
is a slippery slope. It's more about respect. It's not about not using, or you can only cook, that food that was eaten in a 5-mile radius of where your great grandmother was born. It's more about the thing that needs to happen is that thing that you postulated, Laura, the Jamaican woman running a Japanese restaurant. Why not? But it must be done respectfully. Or to flip it, the Japanese woman running a Jamaican restaurant that charges the same kind of prices that might be perceived of by the public at large as being merited, large quotation marks, in a Japanese restaurant, but now being applied to the Jamaican food. And that's what we're talking about, I think, in another kind of way. It's not about who cooks what. It's about the kind of respect and the kind of, all that goes around it. I don't want to go into the chapter and verse about that come with it, as you well know. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, which doesn't need to happen. But I think that, when we start talking about who's in the kitchen and what comes out of the kitchen, that's one thing. But when we start talking about a certain kind of equity about it all, then that's when we begin to have that real conversation. Why are there some foods that people are love to death, but only want to pay top price, $29.95 for? And there are some other things that people will spend, $200 for. And that, is, as you said, rightfully so, another sort of discussion perhaps to have at another point in time. But I think that that's part of what we're talking about. And I just want to take 1 minute here to open and close the parentheses. I don't want to be terribly professorial, but we kind of fangirled on each other. I want to fangirl for a minute on Therese, because the reboot of the website is just over the moon fabulous. And the month-long challenge is incredible. So will you please take a second and just tell everybody what you're doing, because I think it's important.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harris. So for a long time, my site was really, like I said, just cathartic for myself. I was working a lot. I work as a chef every day. So my 80-hour week really left very little time for the cultural work that I was interested in doing. And over the years, it's working with Dr. Harris in many ways, but just over the years, I've gotten many more opportunities to be much more confident on the cultural side of my work. So my website, Black Culinary History, is just this sort of repository, and I rebooted it last spring. And it sort of lives now more effectively as an archive, but I don't utilize my social media platforms very effectively. I hadn't really ever had a lot of time to invest in posting intentionally. And so the September 22nd to the end of the year is 100 days, and it's a perfect little insulated capsule of time to post. And it really is just sort of about the ways I distill and digest Black culture for professional cooks. And so 100 days, I'm very intentional about these posts. It's not just sort of a random Black history factoid, a person I think is amazing. It's why I think they're amazing, what their work means to the nuance of how we show up as Black in this work. And so I'll sort of be using the 100 days to make these posts, but they'll live also on my site as a database. It'll kind of it'll go forward after the top of the year. But it's just this place to love on it and provide a sort of inspiration point, a starting point for folks coming to the ideas of how we show up in this work. And so, I don't know, it's been affirming for me, just to Dr. Harris's point, reading a lot and consuming a lot over the last 13 years of my site. But I feel like I'm filled up to a degree that I can start to express it in ways that are tangible for other people.
I think that's a perfect segue into having you all speak about the work that you're doing now. I can't believe that we only have just a few minutes left in this conversation. It has been quite amazing. And so please, if you can tell us what you're up to right now and how people can follow you. And then also, if there's any piece of your work that has not been a part of this conversation, please highlight that as well. So Therese, before we move on, is there anything that as a part of your work has not been highlighted that, that maybe is that nook and cranny we need to go find?
I don't think so. So please go to the website, blackculinaryhistory.com. You can follow me on all socials at Black Culinary. But I do a limited series podcast called Black Desserts. And it's the funnest thing I've done so far. It's to sort of just toe dip into intentional storytelling or front-facing storytelling. And it is in partnership with Talenti, but we are I'm working on season 2 right now, and it's just a love letter to Black folks in pastry. I think that we have this beautiful legacy of baking traditions, and this season is a little bit more abstract maybe, but it's really just sort of talking about ruminating on the way that Black folks give themselves over to give us delicious sweets. So season 2 will launch mid-November, but yeah, that's the only other thing. You can follow me on socials and just check me out.
I love it. Soleil, tell us what you're up to and how we can find you.
Sure. Oh, I will say first, Therese's podcast voice is very soothing, very calming. It makes my heart so happy. So highly recommend Black Desserts. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, I just write. I write every week. I make reviews, do a little dance in my column, but you can find it at sfchronicle.com, the food section. And that's kind of it. I just exist. I just eat. Yeah. Don't follow me on Twitter. It's not very smart. So.
I love it. Laura, is there anything that you're up to and that we should know about?
My last book was called What She Ate, and it was culinary biographies of 6 women. I looked at each of their lives through their relationship with food. So my current book kind of jumps off of that. It's about food and the making of relationships. I'm looking at couples, not necessarily romantic couples, but 2 people who are brought together as friends or mentor mentee, one definitely romantic couple, and one pair of enemies actually, and how food works through that relationship to create that particular kind of relationship, and how it's kind of a third party with these couples. I'm at work on the book now. COVID has interrupted a lot of the research, as you can imagine, and now all the publishing houses are very busy churning out the Trump books and the climate crisis books. So the day will come when this book surfaces.
Thank you. And also Dr. Jessica B. Harris, who I have now recently discovered I had on my way from college, and I was learning about Kwanzaa and really getting into our history. There was a book called A Kwanzaa Keepsake.
1995.
1990.
Past.
And so I think I got my hands on it in 1998. And I had just graduated from college, kind of get my own apartment, setting up my own traditions. And there you were. And I'm realizing like this is a full circle moment. So taking us from that point to now, I would love to hear what you've got in the oven and, what
Oh,
you're,
good
and how we
Lord.
can find you.
Well, I am I'm sort of findable on Instagram. I really don't do Facebook because I just go down the rabbit hole every time I get into Facebook. But on Instagram, I am Dr. Jessica B. Harris or Afri Cooks. I am working on a variety of new things. First of all, High on the Hog, which is a Netflix documentary that was based on my book of the same name, has been renewed for a second season. So I'm not sure what degree of involvement I'll have, but time will tell and we'll see what's what with that. I am doing 3 columns, one for eatingwell.com called Diaspora Dining, that's monthly, one for today.com called My Culinary Compass, that is more international as opposed to the diaspora, and one for Southern Living in print called The Welcome Table, which was the title of a book I did also in 95. I am going to start podcasting again, probably toward the end of the year. I have already on iTunes a series of 36 podcasts of food, music, travel, and memoir that I did several years ago. And I'm now going to be working with Stephen Satterfield's new platform. So I'm going to be doing some podcasting on Whetstone. And I've got 2 new books. One is called Braided Heritage, and it will hopefully be out, hopefully be out in, maybe late 22, 23. And it is based on the conceit that the food of the United States of America is essentially, the foundational food is a braid, and that the braid is Native American, African American, and European American. And then I further define those. And then the other one is called Strangers at the Feast, and it's basically 5 centuries of, well, not really, 5 generations, not 5 centuries. We're old, but we're not that old. 5 generations of an African American family and food.
Well, I must say that when we were curating this conversation, I thought I had the understanding of the perfection that would be in this moment to hear you all speak to each other. But then just to see how you all went into this intergenerational conversation in ways that I just couldn't even imagine. And of course, I can't imagine how you would do these things. This has been amazing. This has been phenomenal. It is an honor to have you all as a Fresh Talk speaker, to add to our list of the amazing voices that we have heard here. If there is any opportunity for you all to connect to each other, to support each other's work in any imaginative way possible, please do so. If something happens that you think that we should be aware of, please let us know. We love to see how these relationships turn into many other things. And maybe that's something we should also talk about more, what happens when people get together here. So I say this and just thank you. I thank you all. And I close this out this evening. This is a very heartfelt moment for me to have this project Reclamation, have this moment, to have these programs to talk about some of these issues that you couldn't put in the exhibition, that you couldn't put, especially in online exhibition. And to see you all just get to everything has been quite amazing. So thank you all for this moment, and our audience, thank you for joining us. There was a question, but it was answered. It was like, as soon as the question went in and it was talking about appropriation and how, cultures come together, how that redefines you all started talking about it as if you read it already. So that question was answered. And all I can say is thank you. And a special thank you from Susan and from our whole board of directors that you all could be here. Everyone have a wonderful evening and good night.
Goodbye.
Thanks very much.